Welcome to the show. The Ukrainian military has agreed to a 12-hour ceasefire with Russia to allow civilians escape through evacuation corridors from several cities. Russia and Ukraine agreed to open evacuation routes in half dozen Ukrainian cities Wednesday morning. Ukrainian officials said that several towns west of Kyiv had begun moving civilians, mostly women and children, toward the capital. Such corridors have failed repeatedly in the past few days as Russia has pressed its offensive with stepped-up brutality. It is hoped that civilians will again be able to escape the northeastern city of Sumy, where around 7,000 people were evacuated from the city on Tuesday. A convoy of evacuees has left the southern city of Hoda. U.S. President Joe Biden had on Tuesday announced a ban on Russian energy imports into the United States as Ukraine's president urged the UK Parliament to strengthen sanctions against Russia. In response, the Kremlin accused the United States of declaring an economic war on Russia that is sowing mayhem through energy markets. Now, Moscow has put Washington on notice that it is considering a response to the ban on Russian oil and energy. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov referred to the sanctions as a hostile act. Well, for more on what's happening at the border as refugees make the risky trip to flee Ukraine, here's Arise International correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya.
Viesna Nyameka, that is the name of the Slovakian side of the border town. It's border with Ukraine, and we've been here since the beginning of the day tracking the progression of Ukrainian refugees crossing over into Slovakia. And the situation they find once they cross over is definitely very positive. There's an organized humanitarian response welcoming them over into Slovakia, welcoming them over into safety. One of the first ports of communication they'll find is with the Slovakian border force if need be, and that's definitely been the case with many of the refugees, most especially women traveling with young children. There'll be border force agents there dragging their bags over into this area, allowing them to have some relief if they are traveling with young children. Once they do reach this area, one of the first ports that they can go to is a tent where they can register their names and identity and make themselves known to groups and organizations who are offering immediate overnight accommodation for women and children. Thereafter, there's a plethora of tents that are offering hot food and hot drinks and dry foods, and also there's another layer of an area where you can get access to clothing, to jackets, hats, scarves, shoes, baby carriers, buggies, pushchairs, a whole host of humanitarian products that have been left on the ground and left in the areas free for Ukrainian refugees, free for refugees from Ukraine to come over and access. Another layer is the business side of the humanitarian response here. Also on the ground, you've got SIM operators O2 who have been registering refugees for free, giving them SIM cards that come preloaded with credit, allowing them to make phone calls, and also comes preloaded with around 15 gigabytes of data. And that's just one example of private companies being able to show themselves here on the border with Ukraine, where Ukraine meets Slovakia. Now, Slovakia itself has a number of borders that many people have been using of recent to get into safety. This is just one of them, but there are definitely borders for vehicle crossing, for pedestrian crossing, for trains, and also for bicycles. This is one for vehicles and also for people walking by foot across into Slovakia. And as I've said, there's a very clear and dedicated and organized response to them. In addition to the food and accommodation aspect of the response here, should refugees from Ukraine want to travel deeper into Slovakia, those resources are also on the ground. There's a whole queue of coaches and vehicles that are here taking them to different areas of the country, one of them being the local airport, which is around an hour and a half's drive from here, and also onwards to other destinations. and also to the borders of other countries. You've got representatives from the Czech Republic, which is also a neighboring country to Slovakia, just to give you another idea of just how far-reaching this humanitarian response goes. And earlier, when we first reached here, of course, there wasn't that many people at that point in the morning who had crossed over, but over time, as we've dragged further on during the day and into the afternoon and later evening, that's definitely been the case, where more and more people have been coming over and have been met with a level of warmth and support that.
All right, thank you so much, Adefemi Akinsonya, Arise News international correspondent, bringing us updates from Slovakia, as we have some of these people, refugees actually pouring into neighboring countries, and we hope they get all the support that they will need. Well, let's bring in Charles Kupchan, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. He joins us now, and let's talk about some of these evacuation corridors provided by both Ukraine and Russia earlier this morning. What do you make of that? Do you think Russia will be able to keep up to this agreement of having a temporary ceasefire to allow all of these citizens to actually look for an escape route?
Well, the track record is not good. You know, we've seen multiple ceasefires over the last couple of weeks. We've seen promises from Russia to provide corridors to get civilians out of cities that they're bombarding. And then we hear 30 minutes later that they launch an artillery attack and kill people. So, you know, let's hope that this pledge of a ceasefire and humanitarian evacuation will stick. But I have to say, I'm somewhat skeptical, and I'm guessing that in the hours and days ahead, what we will see here is a military escalation by Russia, because they seem intent on capturing the main cities in eastern Ukraine, including the capital of Kyiv.
Let's talk about Russia actually telling the United States that this ban on oil and energy imports is actually an economic war. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, Putin has said several times in the last week or so that the United States and its NATO allies are waging the equivalent of war against Russia by imposing severe economic sanctions. The announcement by President Biden yesterday about bans on Russian energy is actually a relatively small step compared to the steps taken earlier. For example, to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank, to prevent technology imports into Russia, to sanction major Russian banks, some of their largest banks, to go after oligarchs around Putin and Putin himself. So what we're seeing here is a steadily escalating set of sanctions that are trying to impose more pain on Russia and on Putin, so he decides to de-escalate. So far, it's not working. Putin talks about economic war. He talks about putting his nuclear forces on alert. So far, it's mostly bluster. But yes, we do need to be concerned about the prospect of escalation, about the possibility that Russia could widen the war by attacking a NATO country. And as your correspondent just demonstrated, she is standing in a NATO country, which is receiving refugees from Ukraine. There is a border between Ukraine and 4 NATO countries.
Let's talk about the U.S. refusing to allow Poland to send the MiG-29 jets to its airbase in Germany, which will then be transferred to Ukraine for its use. And then we've seen Germany also saying that, look, no warplanes will be made available to Ukraine. Don't you think that will squeeze the Ukrainian government and give more room for Russia to be able to complete this attack soonest?
I think that the United States, in coordination with its NATO allies, is trying to find the balance between doing as much as it can to support Ukraine. And we're looking at a massive influx of weapons into Ukraine, including rather high-end Javelin anti-tank weapons, Stinger anti-aircraft munitions, lots of munitions and air and rifles and other kinds of military support. There is an assessment here, and I happen to agree with it, that to begin to transfer MiGs into Ukraine or other fighter aircraft is a risky move because it could potentially trigger Russian escalation. It could potentially trigger a Russian response against NATO countries. That's the key issue here. That is why I think the United States, working with its NATO allies, have decided not to go ahead with the transfer of those fighter aircraft that you just mentioned.
And what do you make of Zelensky's speech at the British Parliament yesterday? He keeps insisting on a no-fly zone against Russia and all of that. I mean, how feasible is all of that demand by Zelensky?
Well, listen, we have to give enormous amount of credit to President Zelensky. He has been remarkably strong. He has been defiant. He has rallied his country against Russia. The resistance that the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian civilians have put up against Russia is remarkable. It really is a stunning effort to fight against a superior military. I think that the prospect of a no-fly zone is dim for the same reason that I don't think you're going to see fighter aircraft transferred to Ukraine. And that is, were NATO to impose a no-fly zone over the airspace in Ukraine, it would effectively mean that NATO fighters and Russian fighters would go after each other. That is the beginning of World War III, a war between Russia and NATO. And that's why, so far, the U.S. is rejecting the option of a no-fly zone. And I expect it to continue to maintain that position in the days ahead.
Are you optimistic that this invasion or war, as the UN is being careful to actually describe all of this, may end in a couple of weeks?
I think that Putin miscalculated. He has been living in a bubble. He has not been getting good, frank information. And I believe that he thought that Ukraine was the old Ukraine, where there were many Russian speakers. There were many people who felt affinity for Mother Russia. That's not the case anymore, especially after Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass in 2014. Ukraine has united with a strong national identity that is opposed to Russian coercion, that is opposed to being under the thumb of Russia. And one of the reasons I think that this military campaign has gone poorly is that Putin thought that Ukraine would capitulate, that it would collapse, that the Ukrainian army would lay down its arms. That's not happening. What comes in the next weeks is difficult to say. I think we're likely to see a military escalation by Russia. They have not brought to bear their full spectrum military capability, their air power, their strongest military forces. So unfortunately, I think that this is a war that Putin believes he cannot afford to lose. And as a consequence, I think we're going to see Russia escalate militarily in the days ahead with an increasing loss of life and destruction in Ukraine.
To try to round up this conversation, do you foresee war crimes being, dished out against Putin in the future? Because we see the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and all of that saying that they're compiling all human rights abuses and all of that. Do you see a potential Putin being put into the dock to answer for all of these crimes, if you may call it that way?
I would make two comments in response to the interesting question. One is that clearly the laws of war are being violated. We are seeing civilians killed on a regular basis. We are seeing Russian missiles and artilleries hit apartment buildings. So this is not a war that is focused narrowly on combat against what we call military combatants. And so, yes, I do think that down the road, it is conceivable that a war crimes case could be brought against Putin. Secondly, I think that many Russians are watching this war. They are seeing Russian soldiers kill their Ukrainian brethren. And Putin himself has said, these are our brethren, these are our kin. We share a common history, religion, there are linguistic ties. And as a consequence, there are protests in the street. Many Russians, including influential elite Russians, are speaking out against this war. And so I do think that it's conceivable that we could see a serious opposition movement in Russia, and that it's possible that Putin may not, in the end of the day, survive this war, because many Russians will see it as a gross miscalculation.
All right, we must thank you so much, Charles Kupchan, who is a senior fellow, Council of Foreign Relations, has joined us to talk about the ongoing war in Ukraine, and it's really good listening to you see all of that.